My theme today is based on my book on climate change, Hell and High Water, and I'm going to make use of that in just a moment. And it's a book which I wrote a number of years ago, back in 2007, 2008, something like that, when the last IPCC report came out. The science in the first half of it is all based on the IPCC or other mainstream science at the time, because I'm not a climate change scientist. What does interest me is to take what the mainstream consensus of the science is saying and then say, what does that mean for the human condition? What does that mean for what we are as human beings in the world today? And how might it inform that central philosophical question that Plato not least first posed of how we might live our lives? And it so happens that in part 2 of this book, which is really the important part, because the first half is just a summary of where the science stands and what the political implications of that might be. The important part is in the second half, where I'm looking at the human condition. I've called it, subtitled it, Climate Change, Hope and the Human Condition. And the hope, ironically, was exacerbated in a deeply personal way, where my wife and I lost our child through stillbirth in the course of my writing this book. And that experience of looking into death in a very first-hand way had a strange transcendental effect, a kind of cutting through ordinary reality into a deeper realm of life that is behind death, life that is behind ordinary life, that we experienced as a paradoxical wellspring of hope. So at the same time as that happened to us at a personal level, and I've written that into the book, it took longer to write than had been planned as a consequence, I was also reflecting on the questions of ecocide, that global warming was, particularly at that time, particularly around 2007, very prominently in the media bringing to the forefront. Now, since then, we've had the experience by which the world's political leaders came to Copenhagen in 2009, was it? And they came and they looked and they saw, but they decided not to conquer, because politically it was going to be too difficult. Politically also, there was a massive PR spin, backed not by the mainstream of scientific consensus, but with the help of a small fringe of climate change scientists whose voice was radically amplified by a mainstream consumerist-driven media that basically wanted to put forward reasons for doing nothing and saying either the problem doesn't exist, or if it does exist, as Bjorn Lomborg said in 2 pages in the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago, if it does exist, and he now accepts that it does exist, he's saying, well, it's going to be too expensive to do anything. And why? Because what he does, he's part of a business school, and what they teach you in business schools is that when you see a future stream of costs, so each ton of CO2 that we emit is going to cost whatever it might be in terms of adverse climate change effects, what the economists do, which in my view is why both the Christian and the Islamic tradition, it's also there in Judaism and certain other traditions, but it's particularly strong in Islam, interestingly, is why they forbid the charging of interest on money, is that the reciprocal of earning interest in money is that you can discount future values. You can take your interest rate and say, well, £100 received in 10 years' time is only really worth, let's say, for argument's sake, £70 in today's money, because if I invested £70 today, interest compounding would give me £100 in 10 years' time. So what the economists say is that £100 worth of damage in 10 years' time discounts down to £70 today. And because your interest rate is compound, once you get as far as 30 years ahead, with most discounting rates that the economists use, you're basically into never, never land. So basically, the children's future is discounted by the economists, and that's how people like Lomborg can say we can ignore the costs of global warming because they're not going to be that great. That's how they can justify turning their backs on the poor of the world in order to safeguard the lifestyles of the rich. Now, this type of prevailing economic thinking, which is the reason why climate change has basically gone off the political agenda just in the past week or so, I see that the Department of Energy in England has decided, we now have these things devolved in Scotland, so some things are devolved and some things not, and I'm not quite sure where the Department of Energy stands. I think that may not actually be devolved, I'm not sure. But it doesn't matter, because the main point is that they previously had 38 staff in the climate change unit, and they're now cutting it down to, I think it was 6 or something of that order. Climate change is right off the political agenda. Nobody wants to know about it, except to say it's not really happening. And there is nothing new in this kind of thinking. There is nothing new in the kind of thinking that the only thing that matters is consumerism. As Eric Fromm put it, to have is to be. If we want to be a human being, we have got to have things. And this, in fact, I think a case could be made, given that this is a festival of philosophy, a case could be made that this problem is one of the earliest problems wrestled with in philosophy. The oldest book in the world, a remarkable book called The Epic of Gilgamesh. Penguin Classics do a very good edition, and there's various more recent editions with commentaries. The Epic of Gilgamesh is all about the hubris of Gilgamesh, the young man who decides he's going to prove himself by going to the Green Mountain and cutting down the cedars of Lebanon, basically, and using them to build a great monument to himself. And such is his tyranny that he's like Uday Hussein, the son of Saddam Hussein. Such was his tyranny that he's conscripted all the young men to his armies. He's raped all the young women, taking them from their lovers and so on. The people prayed to the goddess of creation. And the goddess of creation fashioned out of clay Enkidu. Enkidu, in Jungian psychological terms, you could see as being his own primordial, natural self, not the besuited city slicker that Gilgamesh was, but his primordial wild man self. And Enkidu and Gilgamesh wrestle. Now, in ancient mythology, when people wrestle, they are usually trying to seek blessing. And in the end, Gilgamesh wins, but it's such a close contest that they basically congratulate and befriend each other. So you have this kind of coming together of the two sides of Gilgamesh. And he recruits Enkidu to his project of cutting down the cedars, of destroying the god of the mountain who is there to protect nature. But to cut a long story short, in the course of it, Enkidu, the wild man, gets killed. And all you're left with is a shallow, superficial, ego, narcissistic shell. They talk today about us living in the age of Narcissus. And all you're left is this narcissistic young man who goes around spending his time killing lions. So Gilgamesh is often featured in ancient mythological art, holding a lion by its tail in each hand that he's just killed. The lion killer, the great banker, the great baron of the press. The man, and it usually is men, sorry to say, in gendering terms, the man who should have used the psychological first half of his life, as the Franciscan Richard Rohr would put it, to build up his outer ego shell, his sense of who he is, his competence in this world, and so on, and then have moved on to the psychological second half of life of spiritual development, of deepening, of living out of that shell but progressively letting go of it, has stayed stalled in that teenage narcissistic dynamic. And when you look at people like Rupert Murdoch, they're still doing it even at the age when a man should be long past it. And that's what you've got with Enkidu, and basically he becomes more and more lonely, more and more empty. In the end, when he meets the goddess again in the form of Sidiri, the bearer of wine. He cannot even accept her offers of love, or the goddess's offers of love, who he rejects. We know that kind of man. We see that kind of man in the masters of the universe all the time. So there's Gilgamesh, 5,000 years old, representing this portrayal. And of course, in the end, I'm sorry, what I should say, in the end, the Great Flood comes. And the Great Flood is the punishment of the gods for this hubris. And I'll just read you what the Epic of Gilgamesh has to say about the flood. And this is of great interest to theologians, because the dating of this text is around the same time as the story of Noah's Ark. There are many, many Middle Eastern flood narratives rooted in this period. And like in Noah's Ark in the Bible, the cause of the flood was human hubris. Human hubris coming from the Greek hybris, which is also the meaning of the word violence. So hubris, or excessive pride, and violence go hand in hand. And Gilgamesh says, lay upon the sinner his sin, lay upon the transgressor his transgression. Would that the lion had ravished mankind rather than the flood. Would that the wolf had ravished mankind rather than the flood. Would that famine had wasted the world rather than the flood. Would that pestilence had wasted mankind rather than the flood. It's as if all these other things are relatively minor, but a massive flood is such a major thing that it kind of wipes out everything. Now, jump ahead 2,500 years, and we get to 2,500 years ago and to Plato. And Plato was very strong on flood narratives a number of times, particularly in the Laws and the Critias. He talks about floods coming. In the Laws, he describes how periodically what happens is that humans become hubristic, and particularly when people are living in cities. They become more and more self-centered. They forget about nature. They forget about who produces things in the countryside. They become more and more obsessed with themselves. They forget about the gods. They become obsessed with making money, with power, with raising armies, with colonizing, and all of that kind of thing. And the gods get fed up with it, and so the gods send a flood. And what the flood does is it destroys the city, and that means that humankind then repopulates itself from the honest shepherd folk in the mountains, who had never been tainted by all of that in the first place, and who gradually expand their numbers until the cities are rebuilt again and the whole cycle repeats. Now, why are these flood narratives so common in that era when writing was first invented? There's probably a very good reason. Plato twice dates his flood narratives back to 10,000 years before his time. In other words, he's talking about a period around 13,000 years ago. What was happening at that time? At that time, we were seeing very rapid sea level rises. You think about the Red Sea, today with an average depth of about 80 meters. At that time, it was dry land. At that time, a number of the early ancient cities were on the bed of the Red Sea. But what was happening is that as a consequence of the ending of the last ice age, sea levels were rising very rapidly. When the last ice age was at its height 20,000 years ago, world sea levels were depressed by 120 meters. And so as that ice melted, you had rapid sea level rise, and at times those rises would be quite dramatic. At times you could imagine water breaking through some natural boundary and inundating a large area inland. Also, as a consequence of rapid sea level rise, as we're now, or as I should say, as the scientists who are experts in this area understand, you're getting more, you get tectonic instability. So as the sea level is rising, you get earthquakes being set off. Those cause tsunamis, and that further endangers communities which once might have been a safe distance from the water's edge, but are now very close to it. And of course, we're again in that situation today. At the moment, according to the satellite measurements, sea level is rising by 3 to 3.3 millimeters a year. Now that might not sound much, but if you think of it, 3.3 millimeters, that's every 3 years you get a centimetre of sea level rise. Every 10 years you get about 3 centimetres, you get what's that, just over an inch and a half, something like that, every 10 years. And what's happening is that it's creeping up. If you think how much it's gone up in your lifetime, the IPCC are reckoning about this much by the end of the century. James Hansen said it might be the height of this cupola in here. Nobody's quite certain on that because of all the uncertainties as to what might happen. But very few serious scientists doubt that this is happening because of global warming at the moment, or primarily because of global warming, and that is very likely, more than 95% certainty, the IPCC reckon, to be human-driven. Now I want to, because this is the Philosophy Festival, I want to stay anchored in the philosophy of this. I don't want to go too much into the science, not least because I'm not an expert in the science. I would only just want to mention that for those of you who might be thinking of the report in Nature a couple of weeks ago, suggesting that global warming is not coming on quite as fast as we might have thought, the bottom line, as quoted on the BBC website by the chief scientist who wrote that paper, is that their findings give no comfort whatsoever to the skeptics of global warming. That in their view, this is a transient slowing down, it's not a change to the long-term picture. So I would just like to point that one out, because there is a narrative going just now that global warming is no longer happening and it's not a problem. So I'm going to work on the mainstream consensus that it is happening. And I want to stay back with Plato, because Plato did a lot of thinking about the effects of hubris in his time. He really saw it as being the central issue, what today we would call consumerism. And Plato's greatest work was The Republic, in which he starts off by posing the question, in what does goodness reside? What does it mean to be a good human, to be a virtuous human being? And he's sitting there in the marketplace with all his friends, and they're discussing this, and they're wondering, how can we get into this problem? It's very difficult to see inside the minds of human beings. So how about we do what today they would call a thought experiment? I mean, there's nothing new in all of this stuff. I very much go with Whitehead that all philosophy is footnotes to Plato, including, incidentally, postmodern philosophy. Plato was the master of deconstruction. The difference between Plato and the postmodernists is that the postmodernists deconstruct and then they leave their toys all scattered around the nursery. Whereas Plato also had the grace. He had that connection with the divine in order not just to deconstruct, but also to reconstruct. And that's what we're needing today. Now, Plato, in examining this question of where the good lies and its antithesis in hubris, says, okay, how about we do an experiment? Since it is hard to discern what the good is in a human being, we will look for where it lies in the city. We will construct an imaginary republic, a city republic, and ask where it lies. So his friends all say, what a good idea, Socrates, because of course Plato would very often write his stuff through the representation of Socrates, his tutor and master. Socrates himself never actually wrote anything down. It's all written down for us by Plato. So there's Socrates actually in the marketplace, and Plato's describing it. And his pals say to Socrates, well, look, you kick off. You tell us what you think your idea of the perfect way of living is from which we might then discern human virtue. And I'll just describe how I've got it here. Socrates kicks off by laying out his table. His ideal city-state is the rustic idyll. In our sense today, what it describes is more of a village than a city. Men and women would spend their time in honest pastoral and craft work, living simply, caring for their children, guarding against poverty and war, eating a humble but wholesome vegetarian diet. I have to confess that when I see the Globe Cafe there, I fall down on that front. Drinking in moderation, and in their spare time, singing hymns to the gods. In other words, spiritual pursuit. Spiritual pursuit as the ultimate, what you do when you've washed your face and you've made your honest livelihood. It's a bit like life back on a Hebridean croft, the context in which I was raised, but with olives and cheese instead of herrings and potatoes, or an Amish community in North America, or a custom village in Vanuatu, where modern ways have been rejected by kinship groups that choose to retain tradition. Socrates warns that, quote, ambition and love of money are something to be ashamed of. And the test of right livelihood is that the people, quote, leave their children to live as they have done. In this way, he presages the definition of sustainable development that the United Nations Brundtland Commission came up with 2.5 millennia later, namely that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. Isn't that powerful? That right livelihood is to leave their children to live as they have done. Written 2,500 years ago. It's a trip. Okay, so Govan, who's a kind of petulant city sloan, pops up and tells Socrates that he and his followers expect to eat meat plentifully on the table. They want homes furnished with gold, ivory and art, perfumes and adornments for their wives and courtesans, clothes and shoes, entire classes of servants and nannies, both wet and dry, for their children. And he says, if you had been founding a city of pigs, Socrates, this is just how you'd have fattened them. And he demands what he calls the ordinary dishes and desserts of modern life. And to this, Socrates replies, very well, I understand. We are considering apparently the making not of a city merely, but of a luxurious city. And perhaps there is no harm in doing so. From that kind too we shall soon learn, if we examine it, how justice and injustice arise. I, for my part, think that the city I have described is the true one, what we might call the city of health. So there we are, Plato or Socrates, patron saint of house shops. But if you wish, let us also inspect a city which is suffering from inflammation. Whew. And so, with his sword now suitably blooded, the Platonic Socrates turns to his famous question and answer method, his deconstruction method, ruthlessly teasing out the contradictions in Glaucon's aspirations. Then I dare say even the land which was sufficient to support the first population will now be insufficient and too small, says Socrates. Yes, says Glaucon. Then if we are to have enough for pasture and ploughland, we must take a slice from our neighbour's territory, and they will want to do the same to ours, if they also overpass the bounds of necessity and plunge into the reckless pursuit of wealth. Yes, that must happen, Socrates, he said. Then we shall go to war at this point, Glaucon, or what will happen? We shall go to war, he said. And we need not say at present whether the effects of war are good or bad. Let us only notice that we have found the origin of war in those possessions which are most responsible for all the evils that come upon cities and the men that dwell in them. Certainly. Then, my friend, our city will need to be still greater, and by no small amount either, but by a whole army. It will defend the substance and wealth we have described, and will march out and fight the invaders. Yes. Then Glaucon, with natures such as these, how are they to be prevented from behaving savagely towards one another and the other citizens? By Zeus, he says, that will not be easy. Now, I didn't unpack where we might go from there because I thought let's leave the time for your questions and we can see what comes up there. So there's a roving mic. I'm very deaf, so I might have to come and stand close to you, but go for it. There being no questions, I will go and have breakfast. Or responses.
Okay, well, no questions or responses then. Again, thank you.
I have a sort of question. I'll speak up.
Thank you. I'll just come and stand beside you and then make sure I catch you.
Not that it's necessarily related to anything you're talking about, but it's about human beings, and that is the logic of robots. Robots. When we look at human beings, we've got a few billion of them. What is the role of robots in relation to human beings? Because robots seem to be being developed to do what we already do. So are we assuming that the flood will then come and wipe out Bangladesh and those countries and all those human beings, and we'll then have robots as a replacement?
Well,
is that the logic? Because the logic of robots baffles me.
you see, I think we have to read any ancient text like this wisely. I am neither a modern nor a postmodern thinker. I'm a pre-modern thinker. I'm an essentialist. I believe that reality is grounded in spiritual reality and unfolds from out of that deep flow of life, which is love made manifest. And robots I see entirely as tools. I do not believe that a robot can become conscious in the way that a human being is, because I do not believe that consciousness is a function of the brain. I believe, like Eastern philosophy does, that the brain moves in consciousness and is like, in a sense, a radio receiver set for consciousness, rather than the means by which consciousness is generated. In other words, I see consciousness as a quality of reality and not something that is a production of reality. And therefore, a robot is only ever a tool. I was dismayed the other day to read that psychotherapists in America are developing robotic responses, computer responses, for counselling soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, this is cognitive behavioural superficiality taken to the extreme. Why do I call it superficiality? Because it fails to grapple with what a human being really is. You see, the question that the ancient philosophers, and this is why I love Plato, I'm well aware of Popper's critique, I'm well aware of the authoritarianism that you also find in Plato. But fundamentally, I love his stuff because he grounds it into an understanding of divine. He just didn't get it all right, especially not for our age today, in my view. But he's doing the right thing. He's got the right reference point. His reference point is not his ego. His reference point is the deep self, the soul, which taps you through into the divine, however you might understand God or goddess, or whatever your tradition might be of comprehending the divine. And so what robotics fails to do is it fails to operate at the level of the soul, at the level of poetry. And my answer would be that inasmuch as we are living in a world that is becoming more and more automated. So, for example, I live in Govan in Glasgow these days for the past 8 or 9 years, which some of you will know from the Rab C. Nesbitt show, and indeed some of the extras in that show are people, are my neighbours, who I know. And now even the jobs in the supermarket, the checkout are going because it's all self-scanning stuff and so on. The kind of labour that robotics can do is becoming redundant in human terms. Now, my answer to that is it throws us back onto Plato's First Republic, the city of health that he described, the city in which you do your basic work for the day, and then you spend your time. Plato described it, he encapsulated it as singing hymns to the gods. I would sum it up as psycho-spiritual development. I would sum it up as an understanding of deepening our connection with spiritual reality, which is not just a question of sitting and meditating and that, whatever that kind of thing might be, but it's a question of reconfiguring our whole life as what gives health on the planet and what brings health to the planet. So I would include in singing hymns to the gods the work of ecological restoration, the work of creating a world in which the birds can also sing their hymns to the gods, and so on.
At the start you mentioned hope.
Yeah.
That somehow in the face of all the hubris and everything, you can still find hope. I wonder where do you find that hope?
Where do you find it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've obviously personally found it.
In Hay-on-Wye, I made a distinction, albeit an arbitrary one, because we have to, when we use words, sometimes we have to define our own usage. I distinguished between optimism and hope. And I saw optimism as kind of superficial stuff. You know, Bjorn Lomborg, it'll all be okay in the future because technology will overrule the damage caused by global warming. That's optimism. I see hope as something deeply inner, something deeply transcendent, something that comes from connection with the roots of what gives meaning in life. And so I would say, I mean, if you want me to be really blunt about it, because there's other questions, you find hope and faithfulness to God. I'm not going to unpack that further. I know that's very loaded. Do your own unpacking. Next question.
Good morning, thank you.
I gave it easier direct than from the mic.
You said that...
Use the mic for everybody else.
You said that in terms of the position that global warming has in political debate,
yes,
it slipped a few rungs on the ladder.
Yeah.
When and why do you think it will get back to the right point on that ladder?
Very good question. I cannot give you a quick answer to that. I don't have an easy answer, because a lot of us thought, 10 years ago, a lot of us were saying all it needs is a few big disasters and then everybody will wake up. When you have the kind of eastern seaboard of New York, New Jersey and so on, wiped by that massive flood last year, you have that kind of thing. There's been an unprecedented number of huge disasters. The centre of Brisbane flooded, huge, massive floods in the world, even in England here, the kind of flooding that's been happening here. And it's kind of like, it doesn't shift an awful lot politically. And I think part of the problem is that, these things tend to hit marginal people. In the case of the eastern seaboard of New York, it was tending to hit retired people who living by the seaside, maybe second homes, that kind of stuff. In the case of third world countries, it hits the poor. Whereas the rich and their houses on the hill, there's room at the top there telling you still, but first you must learn how to smile as you kill. If you want to be like the folks on the hill, a working class hero is something to be. The people at the top, the decision makers, aren't really being hit very hard by it. I did a calculation on the cost of the English floods back in 2007, and it was a fraction of 1% of GNP. And so, in a sense, it's not big enough. And if it is big enough, people get so anaesthetized. I mean, George Marshall, a friend of mine, very important English climate change thinker. George Marshall's currently been touring the world, interviewing people in areas hit by exceptional climatic events. And he's shocked, it's going to be in a forthcoming book, he's been shocked, especially in America, at the extent to which they deny that it's anything to do with anthropogenic global warming. So I don't actually know. And the take that I have on that personally, where do you find meaning in a situation like that, is that come what may in the come to pass, the name of the game is to deepen our humanity. Now for me, that means solidarity with where the suffering is. That's why I live in Govan, because I'm involved in working with poverty issues in an urban area. For me, the name of the game is that. For me, what suffering does to people is it opens them up to deeper layers of psycho-spiritual being. And so, I don't have an answer to your question. I can only say that given what happens, we need to ask, how do we want to make use of that to attend to the issues that Plato raised so clearly? How might we live our lives more fully, more deeply, more wonderfully, to a greater capacity of our humanity?
I just wanted to, it's probably not my place to respond to that, but I'd like to anyway. Just
Please
say
do.
to people, generally, don't wait for the politicians is my immediate answer. For God's sake, you know, the whole Gandhi cliche of be the change you want to see in the world. Please don't wait for, you know, some kind of central...
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
get on with it. Whatever,
Exactly.
you know what you've got to do it, and everyone does, you know, etc., etc. Anyway, what I wanted to say was, I don't come from a philosophy background. I don't come from a scientific background either, particularly. So forgive my ignorance, and I'm probably not very articulate either. But what I kind of wanted to say was, I'm a bit sick of hearing about how selfish people are, and you know that's why the situation with climate change in particular is hopeless, because we're all too selfish. Well, I don't think I am, and I know plenty of other people that aren't particularly selfish. I'm not saying that doesn't mean I'd never want my own way. I don't know if that's the same thing in philosophical terms or not, because obviously I do want my own way sometimes, but I don't think, overridingly selfish. And as I say, I know really other good people, I suppose like minds tend to hang out together, who aren't either. So I don't see that we're just these awful people that, you know, aren't going to change anything because we're all too selfish. Because I think most people with any kind of spirituality, soulfulness, intelligence, whatever, recognise that this is not a singular problem to be dealt with in a singular fashion. You know, we do all need each other, and we all do have to rely on each other more so than ever, the way things are going. I just wondered what you think about that notion that we are all just hopelessly selfish, really. Thank
Well, I hope I didn't say that we are all hopelessly selfish.
you. No, you did, but there's this...
Yeah. I think, I mean, I would define consumerism as consumption in excess of what is needed for dignified sufficiency. And dignified sufficiency varies from culture to culture. So what you need for dignified sufficiency in this culture is different from what you might need in, say, one of the Papua New Guinea villages in which I worked for 4 years. So it's a relative thing. The problem that I have is with a culture that canonizes greed. There was an advert for Lynx deodorants a few years ago, one of those big billboards. It said, "Greed is good," and the lettering was all done by nearly naked women. That canonization was greed that you see so strongly in banking culture, but what drives it in banking culture, is we with our own investments, pensions, whatever it is, constantly moving to get the highest rate of interest, and therefore rewarding and driving that kind of behaviour. So I think that there are emergent properties to much of our ordinary everyday behaviour that have the consequence of being selfish, especially relative to the poor in the earth. And so, you know, as Plato again would say, an unexamined life is not worth living. We need to examine our lives and identify the roots of selfishness. And when we find them, which I find in my own life, what do you do about it? Sometimes it's very difficult to do anything about it. I hinted earlier that I'm addicted to eating meat, and I know the ecological cost of it. I grew up in a community where we hunted and produced our own meat and so on. It's kind of deeply built into me. But I recognize that that's a selfishness. And it's something like talking about it here. The first step is when you identify something like that, don't deny it to yourself. if you deny it to yourself, you start distorting reality. You start distorting the world around you. Just acknowledge it. Confess your situation. It's very humanizing also. And I do think there is something in that that brings about shifts. And I can't really answer your question beyond that. I don't know how you live your life, so I can't respond more directly than that. But I do think we all have to acknowledge that selfishness is built into most of us. And it's something that in some ways we can start to tackle. If I look at my life over my 58 years, there are some areas of my life in which I used to be very selfish, and now I'm not. That's shifted. So that gives hope.
Time for one last question.
Thank you. So if we go all the way back to actually Plato's thinking, when he examines what might be the good life, did he ever try to distinguish between the individual considering, I want to live the good life because it is intrinsically a good thing to do, with a second potential motive that if one lives a good life, that could be motivated not by the intrinsic value of a good life only, but also by a feeling of empathy to other people in your society, which, if the role of empathy is important, does that mean now that the human race numbers 7-8 billion as opposed to a few million, that it is harder for us to be empathetic, say, to the floods in Bangladesh where there may be thousands of people drowned overnight?
Well, let me focus on the Plato part of your question because time's short. The criticism of Plato is that he does what many people, including authoritarian Greens, do when they say we've got a problem, therefore we've got to apply a solution to society as a whole. So Popper's criticism in The Spell of the Censures is that Plato basically sets up an authoritarian republic in which there are a number of characters. You've got to remember that Plato was very influenced by Spartan society, and Spartan child rearing was notoriously harsh in order to make warriors of them. And there were a number of aspects of Plato's ideal republic, such as children being taken away from their parents and being collectively farmed in kibbutz-type situations, but without connection with their direct parents. A number of ways which psychologists would see today as being unconducive to empathy. At the same time, in the Symposium and especially in the Phaedrus, Plato says that the true philosopher predicates their work on love, that love is a driving force. And to me that kind of pretty much forgives everything in terms of the downside in Plato. Because I think that if you really anchor what you are doing in the imperative of love, with all the implications of empathy to one's fellow humankind, with all the implications of dissolving selfishness, then you may take wrong paths, but at the end of the day, your heart opens out in the right way. So, thank you.
Thank you.